Thanks, Mark. Yeah, so look, I suppose Anya had, in Anya's talk, she was talking more on the strategic end of it, setting the farm up, the overall stocking rate, where I'm more focusing on the tactics of grazing in both spring and summer, you know, the day-to-day, week-to-week type of stuff. The targets, implementing the targets and adapting them for your own farm, which is important. And then, I suppose, looking back a little bit on 2024 and the lessons that we learned from that. So, yeah, so focusing maybe in a more general sense on the springtime, you know, what way we approach it and what we use. And it's similar to a lot of what Michael said, actually. But, you know, the two tools that we use really extensively is the budget and the spring rotation plan. So, what's the role of those two tools? What are they trying to achieve? And what are the things you need to watch? So, look at the spring budget. The basic idea, what we're trying to do, we're trying to get, as Anya sort of covered, we're trying to get to that mid-April time with enough grass on the farm, of the right quality grass. We're heading cows into peak production, we're heading into breeding, so we need to be, you know, the farm well set up at that stage, and we need to get there with the cows in good nick. So that's what the basic reason we're doing it. Where I find it very useful is it helps you to plan out the spring. So, you know, sitting down in January or whatever your cover is, opening is, looking at, you know, the spring ahead of you, and it helps you to plan it out. And I suppose it's kind of, in a way, it's cow focused in that it's balancing, you know, the grass end of it, utilisation of grass, but also the intake of the cow, getting that, you know, intake up week on week, rising playing the nutrition, and as I say, hitting into the second rotation in a good space. The rotation plan then is a tool that, look at, I suppose it takes a bit of a bad rap in ways. I know with discussion groups that come in, you know, a lot of farmers will say it doesn't really work for me and whatever. We find it very useful. It's important to understand what it's trying to do. It's trying to have your wedge set up for your second rotation, to know that it's easier to manage. And a lot of you would have seen that this year, where you struggled to get through your area earlier on. It left April, May actually difficult enough to manage. So that's what it's trying to do. The key thing with it is to know that your dates are right for your farm. And that's a thing that, look at, if you're measuring, you can put a pretty good stab on it. If you're not measuring, you know, all you're really doing is guessing. And I suppose the last point there is that it's important to know that the two things work together. So it's something that I'd always do when you're doing up rotation plans and budgets. Towards the end of the period, the first rotation, I'd look back and I'd sort of say, right, based on the area that I'm allocating, the grass that I think is going to be there, is there going to be enough? Does it make sense together? If it doesn't, you're going to have to, I suppose, adjust one or the other. So picking that date for your farm. So this slide here is just picking out. So the green line is growth. That's our growth from Ballyhaise. Growth curve, you know, the average of the last 3 or 4 years. And then the orange line is, I suppose, the demand on the budget that I'll show you in a minute. So the date when the two of those lines meet together. So for us, that's usually in around the 20th of April. As Michael said, there's a bit of, you know, there's a bit of change in that year to year, potentially. But you can make that up in the last week or two. You can decide to go a little bit quicker or a little bit slower. But look at your own. If you've got the growth rates or the measurements done, go on to pasture base, look at the grass report. You can get that growth curve for your own farm and see where you are. It's somewhere between, could be the 5th of April for you, it could be the 10th of April, it could be the 20th, whatever it is. That's the starting point. That's where you set your sort of end of your first rotation, and then you work back from there. So this is, I suppose, an example of a budget, you know, pretty typical for us of what we'd be doing, or sorry, the rotation plan that we would be using. So ending our first round will be 20th of April. So the dates are slightly different. It's based on us hitting around about that 45 at that stage. And it's based on an average. It's not just 1 year's growth, it's an average of the farm. So we're hitting the 30% there in and around, you know, Paddy's Day. We're sitting 60% in around the end of March, early April. That's kind of what works for us. The rotation plan, I suppose the key point of it is that it's not a daily allowance tool, and I think that's where some people get caught out, particularly guys that aren't measuring. They've tried to use it and they found that it doesn't work in terms, and it doesn't really from a daily allocation point of view. The way I would use it is, look, you allocate the grass based on the cows going out the lane and how much grass you want to give them and what cover they're going into on a daily basis. And we use this then on a weekly thing to say, well, Are we running too far ahead? Do we need to slow them up? Or are we way behind on our targets and we need to push on a little bit in terms of in terms of grazing? And that's how it works. For me anyway, I would always look at it on a weekly thing, and it's really, really useful. Budget then, look, I know there's a lot of small figures there, but it's just to give you the sort of the basic idea of it. So for us, from where we're coming from, with our growth rates would obviously be that little bit later and slower in spring. And because of that, there's nearly always silage to go into our diet at some stage along, somewhere along the spring. Now, in the past, we would have done it slightly different. We would have put silage in, gone out full-time day and night from the start. In the last couple of years, we've become a little bit more cautious early on, and we'll tend to, following on from Mike Egan's stuff, we'll tend to put that silage in up front rather than going hell for leather at the start and having to feed then heavily then at the start of the second round. So, normally speaking, we're generally starting to graze around the 20th of February, and we'll have usually silage in the diet up until 10th of March. This year it was, you may say, early April or mid-April actually. It was still silage in the diet, but that would be unusual enough. But it'll vary. The main thing is that you've got a plan. You're setting your date, so our date for end of the first rotation is the same on the rotation plan on the budget, and we're working it back. Even with us starting at a cover of 1,000, there's silage to go in. Earlier farms, that won't be the case. They can get away with a good bit less feed. But if it has to go in, I suppose, and it's the message from Anya's talk, to put it in up front if you need to put it in. So what we did here is we actually pulled out, right, so this is late March 24, so obviously 24 was a very difficult spring for most of us. On one side there is, where we would normally be at that stage versus where we actually were. So normally, towards the end of March, early April, we're growing 30, we're out full time, we're usually doing a pretty good job on a good percentage of what grazing we're doing in terms of residuals, and we're feeding in around 3 or 4 kilos a meal, 60% graze, 700 farm cover. That's where we normally would be or would like to be at that stage. Where we actually were this year was we were sitting at 10 of a growth rate. We were out by day only. Residuals was a real struggle, and there wasn't an awful lot you could do about that. We were in at night. We had to feed more meal because we were in at night. But critically at the bottom, our area target grazed and our farm cover was there or thereabouts where we had sort of targeted to be. So where a lot of people maybe threw these things out the window when the going got tough, I'd actually say that they really come into play when you're under pressure. So the last little bit on the spring then is, what the focus is when the going is tough and when you're struggling. In my mind, number one is we have to feed the cow correctly. It was a common enough thing this year on a lot of farms where, guys that were used to being out full time from the start, maybe only out by day, or, maybe some guys not out at all, that they weren't adjusting their concentrate level or the concentrate type. So if you're in the situation where that happens, talk to your advisor and come up with a plan and alter the feed based on what's going into the cow in terms of forage. Look, Anya has mentioned it, and I'm going to mention it, I'll probably mention it a couple of times, the reserve of high quality feed. We're talking about 75 DMD plus silage with good high protein. It's a bale per cow to 2 bales per cow, depending on your soil type. On some really difficult farms, it needs to be maybe even more than that. But we need to have that reserve sitting there. Michael mentioned it, that he does that. He keeps those really top quality bales for springtime, and he has them to go in when he needs to put them in. And the last point there on the cow end of it, I suppose, is the condition score, to watch body condition. Look, cows will always lose condition in that first period, but to watch it and don't let it drop too quick. The second point then is minimise poaching. Michael has covered that better than I will, really, and he said that, look, you use every tool in the box in terms of, trying to reduce it as much as you can. On top of that, particularly on the more difficult farms, you're going to have to accept that some days they're just not going to be ideal, but still trying to keep them out once a day, at least once a day during those difficult periods if you can at all. And, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. It's a better result to get out there, do some grazing, even if the graze out isn't perfect, than to sit in the shed waiting, if you can at all. And then the last point then, I suppose, is hitting your budget targets. It was understandable, I suppose, that people maybe lost the will to measure and so on in the spring gone past. But keeping measuring, keeping recording your area graze, it lets you know where you sit. If you're missing the targets, you just have to reset, go back to square one, and say, well, how am I going to get out of it for the next couple of weeks? And that's basically what we had to do. And I suppose the last point is, well, in my head now anyway, I would sort of tend to be more cautious early in spring. So we're dealing with freshly calved cows, you know, heifers coming into the system, people under pressure. The first few weeks, you know, you can take it easy, you can be cautious. And then as the herd gets more settled, you can be more aggressive in terms of your targets and graze outs. So, look, at Anya, again, has covered a good bit of this, but it's maybe just to reiterate the point to a degree. So, as Anya said, the main target for mid-season is the 1400 cover. Now, I know Anya presented pasture-based data showing that a lot of you that are measuring that that's happening, but there's a lot of farmers out there not measuring where they're struggling to do this, which is understandable when you're not measuring. So, the target is 1400. It's 1400 for a good reason. It's, you know, easy to utilise the grass. That's where you get the best performance. As Michael said, it'll really impact your protein percentages. So that's the target. Everything to the right-hand side of the equal sign is your levers to get to that target. It's not the opposite way around. So look at, you've got a 20-day rotation, 3.5, 3.6 of a stocking rate in that summertime period, allowing your 18 kilos. In that scenario, you need to grow to 65, which in most years we can, you know, we'll get during the midsummer. I know in some dry farms we're struggling to get that this year, but in most years you'll be thereabouts, and your mid-season supplementation will be reasonable. It's not going to get out of whack. What's happening on some farms is people are jacking that stocking rate up. Now, some guys are running at this level all the time. Some guys are artificially pushing it up or closing up lumps of ground for either reseeding or silage making, and they're ending up in a situation where they're at 4 or +4 to try to make those things happen. The problem here is, you know, you're relying on 80 plus of growth, as Anya has said, and what you'll often find is in those situations people are going into heavy covers to have enough grass ahead of you. In that scenario, intake drops, too much fibre, intake will drop, performance will drop, and it's not a good place to be. The alternative strategy there is reduce your allowance, keep your pre-grazing yield the same. The big problem with that is we're into a very high level of feeding mid-season, which is not what we want. So it's about setting the farm up correctly that we can hit those mid-season pre-grazing yield targets. A key part of that then is removing the surplus. So there's a bit of a hatred around bales among the farming population, I find, and people, certain people hate them and they're a lot of work and whatever. As far as I see, they're a huge part of the system. For correcting quality, for pulling that, you're dealing with a supply of feed that's up and down, that's quite variable. So we need to be able to jump in, jump out, and pull those surpluses out. So look at on the work side of it, the question I'd always ask people is, which is more work, removing surplus or filling deficit? So a show of hands, who uses a contractor to remove surplus? A lot of men with their own balers here. Who uses them to fill deficits? Nobody. So when you're removing the surplus, it's a phone call, get the bales made. Some people draw them in themselves, some people, the contractor does everything. But the deficits thing, that's a situation where you have to do it every day yourself. You also have to go out and put up a reel in the paddock to hold cows back. So it's a huge amount of work. If we're setting our system up where there's no room for removing surplus or to eliminate bales, it's not a great strategy in my head. So I suppose then the ins and outs around that, when do you cut the bales? Some people let them build and all so on. I suppose in my head, if you're above 3.5 cows to the hectare on that given week, you see a surplus, you take it straight away. If you're below that level, you can wait for a couple of days, make sure you're okay, and then you whip it out. But it really comes back to what Michael said about the frequency of doing your covers. If you're doing it very often, you see the surpluses quickly, you whip them out, it's not a big deal. If you're doing it less often, what will tend to happen is you go out, you'll see 3 or 4 paddocks that's too strong, you take them out, and when that happens and you pull them all out together, we've often done it ourselves, you'll cause deficits in a week or 2 weeks later. And I think that's the part that actually puts people off using bales as a management tool. Is sometimes when they do it, they find 10 days later, oh God, I'm after actually running out of grass, and that didn't work. It's just a fact of taking too much out too quickly. So it's a big tool in the toolbox, and it was a huge thing in 2024 in terms of sward recovery. So as I said, you know, graze outs wasn't perfect or anywhere near it in spring, so we had a lot of tidying up to do in the summertime, and even that was difficult with the way things transpired. So I've actually put up, this is the growth curve for Ballyhaise here in the blue for this year. So you can see, look, it was late, you know, late start, late spring, growth rates were poor. Then we got this massive spike over a 3 or 4 week period, which we tend to always get. But then it dropped back down. Now, normally we don't get this belly in the middle of it here. That was just down to the cold temperatures. The green line is the stocking or the demand, where we were sort of sitting in around that 60 of a demand. And even at that, there was a couple of periods where we had to jump in and out with bales, which it wasn't ideal. But in that period, talking to farmers, the main thing that people were saying was, oh, quality was terrible. It was terrible because we weren't in the position to take the surplus out in most cases. So don't set your system up that that's the case every year. Set your system up that in most years you will get pulling surplus. So that's it really. So I suppose look at the lessons in my head anyway for 2024 is the value of grass in the diet in spring. You don't miss the water till the well runs dry. So, you know, it's only when grass isn't in the scenario and you try to fill it with silage and meal that you realise the cost, and look, at cows just don't perform as well as when there's grazed grass in the diet. The value of having having reserve of really high quality feed, both from running the system point of view and also the stress on the farmer, because worrying about that, I think, is one of the biggest stresses that people had this year. The value of surplus, setting your system up that you can take the surplus in the summer and keep things on the level as you go through the summertime, and then looking after the cow in terms of getting her well fed, getting her up and going, and getting her produced, because she pays the bills. So that's me. Thank you.